Hi, everybody. So classes end at SICE at 4:30, which means that if students are coming in here, they're going to be a couple of minutes late, but they already know me. So I think we can start so we're not running late, because as you can see, we have a lot of presentations to get through. So welcome to the 2016-17 final practicum presentations. My name is Tanvi Nagpal, and I'm the Associate Director of the International Development Program at SICE. We're all delighted that you have joined us today to hear from these 6 incredibly talented teams of students who worked really hard to produce very high-quality policy and programmatic guidance for their clients. We're also really happy that many of their clients have joined us today. A special welcome to them and to the alumni and practicum friends who are also here today and who opened doors for our students and helped them make connections absolutely everywhere they travel. We're also streaming this event live and would like a moment to welcome those who've joined us online, especially our students in Bologna who are staying up quite late. So before the teams begin, I'd like to take a few minutes to make my Oscar speech. I make one every year. I have a whole bunch of Oscars. So we have a long list of people to thank, and I'm going to start with a big thanks to Dean Vali Nasser and the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs, Peter Lewis, and Senior Associate Dean Myron Kunka for their ongoing support for the last 4 years. We're about to start our 5th practicum next year. We're also really grateful to the Star Family Foundation for their continued financial support, which is absolutely critical to this practicum because it allows all our students to travel in the wintertime. We'd also like to thank the SICE Global Women in Leadership Group for supporting the team of students who worked with the International Center for Research on Women, and to the China-Africa Research Initiative and Professor Deborah Brodigham for supporting the 2 teams which worked in China and Kenya with the World Wildlife Fund. Finally, we have to thank our clients for supporting our teams on the ground, both financially and logistically. Their support allows students to make the most productive use of their short time in the field. The teams and I would like to thank the following individuals who supported them in their field work throughout the year. From Athena in Phenomics, Vijay Palaki, Deepa Karthikeyan, Dr. Joshi, Dr. Chari, and Ms. Pramila. For Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN, the GAIN DC team, Bonnie McLafferty and Teal Yelch, who are here today. Thank you for coming. And Arabasa Paragrant, Tarun Vij and the entire GAIN India team, and Professor Jess Fanzo and Shauna Downs. From the International Center for Research on Women, Stella Mukasa in Uganda, and Dr. Sarah Cambo and Margaret Roy in DC, and Dr. Jennifer McCleary-Sills, who is now with the Gates Foundation in Seattle. From Kona, Monica Brand-Engel, Adam Hartman. I saw Adam before. Thanks, Adam, for coming. Alison Stites, Tushar Thakkar, and Nish Bhutani in India. And from the World Wildlife Fund, the China and Kenya teams, Dr. Hu Tao, Daniel Riley, Jing Yu Jing, Philip Odiambo, Yiting Wang, and Tracy Wang. In addition, we'd like to thank our teams of advisors, Professor Deborah Brodigham, Professors Cinnamon Dornsife, Jessica Fanzo, and Raul Roman. And a special thanks for Alison Harwood for taking on the Kona team. And last but not least, big thanks to Anshu Singh, our student coordinator, for helping me coordinate the practicum this year, and to Ada Ho, the IDEV program coordinator, and Nicole Kazi for absolutely everything that they do, too many to mention. So the practicum will enter its 5th year in 2017, and we love working with old and new friends and hope that our clients will consider working with the team in this coming academic year. Judging by all their emails and questions, the first-year students and our incoming class are very excited to be part of the practicum. The format for this evening is really straightforward. Each team has 10 minutes to condense a year long of work and 10 minutes for your questions. Please keep your questions short. The teams will be around afterwards, and we hope you'll be able to interact with them during the reception. Many thanks again for coming. We're going to start with the Athena team. Okay.
Hello and welcome. We are the Athena Infonomics team. My name is Angela, and these are my colleagues Rose, Birkin, and Galen. Before we begin, we would like to thank our advisor, Professor Nagpal, and our client, Athena Infonomics, a data analytics firm based in Chennai. So I will begin with a brief introduction and our scope of work, followed by Rose, who will present our findings and observations. Then Birkin will walk us through the recommendation we have. And finally, Galen will wrap it up with the impacts of this recommendation and the next steps we advise Athena to take. So first, the current state of health. The southern state of Tamil Nadu is a frontrunner in maternal and child health with low maternal mortality and infant mortality rates compared to the rest of India. The past decade, it has led in current trends in health management, and was the first adopter of the Health Management Information System. It is currently in a transition period from a paper-based to a paperless system. So the overall goal of our project was to analyze and assess the collection of maternal and child health data by ground-level health staff, especially village health nurses. We focus on village health nurse level because they are the main source of data collection for maternal and child health. And then by improving the efficiency at this level, then policymakers are better able to make decisions. So our fieldwork took place in both Punamali and Chennai during a 2-week period earlier this January. We were advised to choose Punamali because it covers urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. We conducted interviews, observations, and focus group discussions. We interviewed village health nurses, policymakers, and medical officers to see how they interact with the data. And finally, IT specialists in regards to the app. We also did observations and visited primary healthcare centers, health sub-centers, and integrated child and development schemes. Finally, at the end of our fields work, we did 2 focus group discussions with 20 village health nurses to validate our findings. Now I'll pass it on to Rose, who will present the findings.
Thank you, Angela. Through our research, we uncovered the process that a village health nurse goes through when she sees a patient for an antenatal. Where do I click? Sorry. Okay. Through our research, we uncovered the process that a village health nurse goes through when she sees a patient for an antenatal or a postnatal checkup. What we discovered were parallel paper-based and computerized data management systems. So throughout each pregnancy, the village health nurse sees a patient ideally 7 to 9 times throughout antenatal, delivery, and postnatal checkups. Each time, she will record the data from her visit in 6 different locations, 4 paper-based locations, and 2 digital locations. The digital systems she uses are the PICME system, which tracks individual pregnancies, and the statewide health management information system. We estimate that village health nurses spend between 9 and 15 hours per week on data management. So aside from repetitive data entry, there are several other data collection challenges that arose. First of all, growing populations make village health nurses' jobs increasingly difficult. Each village health nurse is supposed to cover a population of 5,000 individuals, but through our observations, we found that the majority oversee populations closer to 7,500. So clearly there's a need to increase the number of village health nurses and to reallocate nurses to districts accordingly. Additionally, every village health nurse that we talked to mentioned internet and server connectivity issues as their biggest challenge with data management. Village health nurses will regularly get up very early in the morning or stay up very late at night in order to upload their patients' data into the HMIS and PICME websites when the server traffic is down. There are also frequent backlogs of data and data verification and inadequate inspection of reports coming from the HMIS system. This is a very time-consuming task, and it's the responsibility of the already overworked doctors at the primary health centers. Lastly, there are opportunities for improved use of data. Aggregated statistics and dashboard indicators, which come from the HMIS data, are currently only available to upper-level management and officials. We believe that making them available to village health nurses and primary health center staff would be hugely beneficial. I will now hand it over to Birkin, who will explain our recommendation.
Thank you, Rose. Well, based on our fieldwork observations, our team designed an innovative tablet-based mobile application to address already existing bottlenecks in the maternal and child health management information system. This app, about which you see the diagram, is not a separate system. Instead, it is only a gateway between the data registrar, village health nurses, and two already existing information systems in Tamil Nadu. The app basically will have a form-based navigation that feeds the data first into PICME, which you see at the top, and then necessary statistics about maternal and child health will be automatically generated by an intermediary server, and it will feed into HMIS system. This will enhance the data flow as well as the accuracy of the data. I will now walk you through the data collection process in order to more elaborate on the core functionalities of the proposed application. When VHNs are in the field, they will be using their tablets as a primary data collection and entry tool. Hence, they will no longer have to carry heavy paper-based registers. Instead, they will be using their tablets provided and the application that we're proposing. VHNs will enter the mobile application through specific login credentials, which will enhance the security of the data and the data management system. And very crucially, the mobile application will enable offline data entry option. VHNs will be able to enter the data right in the field without internet connection and server availability. The app will send the data whenever it connects to internet and whenever the server is available. Moreover, the app will have a built-in geotagging function which will enable policymakers to track where a specific data was collected in the field. Lastly, the app will also be able to capture barcodes and QR codes when necessary for data registry. And we believe that its compatibility with Aadhaar National Identification System is one of the crucial features of our proposed app. Now, I will pass it over to Galen to talk about the envisioned impacts of our proposal.
Okay, thank you very much, Birkin. With the proposed app, we believe there will be several benefits for the Tamil Nadu health sector. To begin, we expect that with an app like this one in comprehensive usage, village health nurses' data workloads would get cut from the current 9 to 15 hours weekly to approximately 3 to 5 hours each week, equivalent to saving approximately a full working day. Second, with less need for the VHNs to enter all the information they've collected into multiple registrars with pen and paper and then a couple different computerized systems, we believe there'll be less scope for unintentional errors and help reduce the levels of mistakes in the state's data system. And third, the higher quality of information that this would provide and the more rapid reporting will allow health policymakers to more easily use the data that's in the information systems, and it would allow village health nurses and medical officers at the local level to make use of the information that they're already collecting to help inform targeting and health service delivery decisions. So to recap, we conducted a field assessment examining the challenges related to maternal and child health data collection at the healthcare delivery level in the state of Tamil Nadu. And we observed several challenges that VHNs faced, as Rose discussed. In addition, the state is currently considering a set of overhauls to its current health information systems. Based on our discussions with nurses, health officers, and officials in Chennai, in the capital, we believe that a system like the one we've described would go a long way to advancing Tamil Nadu's digital health systems and complement other hospital-based digital health advances that the state might be working on. From this, we've assembled a preliminary set of steps that would be required to implement a program like the one we've described. To begin, there would need to be the drafting of a systems requirement study. And then from that, the app would be developed and then beta tested, and the approach would be piloted over the course of approximately a year in 3 health districts. And the state would provide the app, the tablets, and any necessary training to participating VHNs. After the year pilot and any issues were worked out, the state could roll out the app and the tablets to the other 39 health districts. So this is a photo of all of us at one of the primary health centers in near the Punamali district. And thanks for listening. We look forward to your questions. Professor Dornsife.
Thanks, Cinnamon Dornsife, and great presentation. Thank you. I'm wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Galen. Just you were the last person talking. You were talking about, reducing errors in the data by just putting it in just one source instead of all the paper sources. How are you going to protect patient privacy, and how did you address that in designing the app?
Sure, it's a good question, and I think most people at both the service, the healthcare delivery level, so the nurses, and at the health official level in Chennai recognize that privacy is an important factor. We believe that first, by reducing the number of paper registers, which one of the photos you probably saw was kind of scattered all over a lot of different places, and by building a system with more modern security protocols that can transfer and store data on government servers in a more secure way than they're currently being stored, we think that that would enhance privacy to a substantial degree. One of the risks might be the perception that it is less secure, because if people see healthcare recipients, antenatal mothers or postnatal mothers, see their data being entered directly into a computer, they might perceive that it's less secure. So that would be something that they'd have to find out during the pilot, I think.
Just to add a couple of things, that it will use, as I mentioned, VHN-specific login credentials, and the server that is located in between the data registrar and the two already existing information systems will function as a one-way. So once VHNs enter the data, they will be partly be able to access what they have entered, but rather policymakers will be able to access whatever it's permitted for them to access, basically, mainly maternal and child health data statistics and so forth. And the proposed application is undoubtedly a step forward in terms of more secure internet protocols.
Hi, guys. So you discussed the potential impact that your app will have on VHN work quality and data quality, but what kind of impact do you foresee this having on overall child and maternal health?
Okay. Thanks, Joe, for the question. We believe, and there's been several studies that you can find in our final report, which will be out in a couple weeks or sooner, that data quality and the time, especially the timeliness of reporting and identifying high-risk mothers, is a critical factor in reducing maternal and child death, especially at late stage and then at when she's giving birth. So as the system is more able to facilitate easier tracking by both the nurses and then by doctors who can help out in emergencies or in high-risk cases, we think that this would cut down on Tamil Nadu's MMR or contribute to it that way.
And just two words on in terms of high-risk mothers. So this clustering of mothers into during their pregnancies for high-risk and low-risk mothers, the app will send push notifications to the tablets, which will keep both VHNs and both policymakers updated and informed in terms of high-risk mothers, because Tamil Nadu has already achieved that level of low maternal and infant mortality rates, that an incremental contribution of the app would be to prevent any other maternal and infant death given by the high-risk mothers.
Hi, my name is Bonnie. I'm from Gain. Have you seen this working elsewhere? Are there examples or models that you can learn from? And I'm just curious, anywhere in the world, whether there are similar things going on.
Okay, thanks for the question, Bonnie. These are all my sections. I apologize. So there is a good number of this kind of community health worker data collection work being done in a wide variety of different contexts. There's work in sub-Saharan Africa. There's some other work in different states in India and other places in South Asia. What makes Tamil Nadu a little bit different is, as Angie discussed, they're a little farther ahead in terms of their health system and health indicators generally. They already have a computerized system, and the computers that the VHNs, the health nurses have, are 5 or 6 years old. They're basically end of life. So this is more of like a second generation system. What we've seen demonstrated in other places, and what any sort of development of this application should try to emulate, if not look for open source solutions, is kind of the front end, the actual tablet interface the nurses are using to collect information and to input it into the system. The database links between the existing mother and child tracking system and the overall HMIS one, I haven't found many examples of, but it's more of just an enterprise software question. It's not as much of a can this work? I think the approach is more with just the VHNs. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
We moved the tall guy over here.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lillian Bidou, and these are my colleagues, Kate Albers, Lauren Purnell, and Sam Williford. And this year, we had the pleasure of working with ICRW, the International Center for Research on Women, as they're opening their Africa Regional Office in Kampala in Uganda. Let me not forget this. ICRW is a leading research institute. They provide research to further initiatives for women empowerment and gender equality. They're known for their research around reproductive health, sexual and gender-based violence, child marriage, and other important issues that affect women today. They're based here in DC, and they have 2 regional offices, their Asia Regional Office in New Delhi and their Africa Regional Office in Kampala. We started working with ICRW in September. We were looking at the East Africa region, at their public and private stakeholders. And then we spent 2 weeks in Kampala, where we met over 20 stakeholders, government officials, international NGO representatives, other civil society actors. So for our final deliverable, we're presenting our client with a report that summarizes our findings and recommendations. Those include potential opportunities and entry points for ICRW in the country, as we looked at the Uganda context specifically. And so just based on our client's needs, those topics include women's political participation, remittances and how those affect Ugandan women, the current situation in the northern region of Uganda, corruption and how that affects civil society, private sector opportunities, and future donor trends. But in the interest of time, we'll only be presenting on 3 of these topics. Sam will be presenting future donor trends at the end. Lauren will be presenting her research on private sector opportunities. And Kate will start here with her research on corruption and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. So one of the key issues that came up repeatedly in our field interviews was the shrinking space for civil society in Uganda. The discourse on human rights and women's empowerment has advanced during the past decade or so, but there remains in Uganda a legacy of strong personal rule and weak separation between the private and the public spheres. So as you can see, the 2016 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index ranks Uganda lower than its neighbors Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Uganda also ranks lowest according to the World Bank's Control of Corruption indicator. So how does this impact civil society organizations? In recent years, there's been increased pressure on media outlets the restriction of peaceful assemblies, and also the introduction of legislation around NGO activity. In January 2016, Uganda introduced the NGO Act to better regulate and coordinate NGOs throughout the country. So this act grants the Internal Affairs Minister and the National Board for NGOs broad powers to supervise, approve, inspect, and dissolve all NGOs that fail to meet specific standards of activity and staffing. So this law, along with the 2013 Public Order Management Act and others pending, limit NGOs and Ugandans from engaging in research or advocacy that could be considered critical of the government. So the result of this is we've seen a number of nonprofits scaling back their activities, relocating or shifting their agendas towards less politically sensitive issues. But we believe there are a number of practical approaches ICRW can take to preserve the integrity of their work and also enhance their relationship with the government. Our main suggestions are, first, local government partnerships. In many of our stakeholder interviews, we heard how effective local district government has been in coordinating NGOs in the healthcare sector specifically. Partnering with local leadership is a practical move as well because Uganda has taken steps to decentralize government. So working alongside the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education and Programming would also help to promote relationships of mutual trust. Secondly, strategic communications. In this difficult environment, it's important for ICRW to advocate for itself and with a clear communication strategy that explains what ICRW does and how it will serve Ugandans, especially in a sustainable way. So this would increase recognition of the organization and also promote local buy-in. Our ICRW is also well placed to craft new narratives that reframe the role of international NGOs in the country. Lastly, grassroots coalitions. A focus on becoming more locally rooted would serve ICRW in the long term. Expanding partnerships beyond internationally recognized NGOs such as Oxfam International or Save the Children, and shifting attention to more alternative engagements such as social movements or women's advocacy and economic empowerment groups will strengthen the case for ICRW's position in the country over time. Thank you, and Lauren will now present on private sector trends.
Thank you, Kate. So after returning from Uganda, we were asked to take a deeper dive into the private sector to find entry points for ICRW. In our research, we have identified potential partners for ICRW and clients for ICRW Advisors, which is a recent rebranding of ICRW's consulting services to better market their expertise to a wider range of clients. In exploring the private sector, we focused on both for-profit businesses and social enterprises, which, given their blended approach, would be more natural partners for ICRW. From our interviews in Kampala, we found a number of organizations that admitted to a lack of capacity when it comes to gender expertise. We interviewed one organization which emphasized that even when they know they need a gender perspective on a project, they aren't sure exactly how to frame their terms of reference or what to ask for from a specialist. Other organizations argued that when they're meeting gender equity requirements for donors, they're often just checking boxes and they don't really feel like they're truly reflecting on their organization. We believe that if these knowledge gaps exist in the nonprofit sector, that they must exist in the private sector as well. The entry points that we have identified for ICRW focus on where their thematic areas align with the missions of social enterprises and the CSR initiatives of corporations. For example, when exploring the banking industry, we found that Centenary Bank has been active in promoting women's financial literacy, while on the other hand, Standard Chartered, which is another prominent bank in Uganda, has women's empowerment programs, but these only exist in other countries, and they've not yet expanded to Uganda. This creates a space for ICRW to start conversations about both existing and potential CSR initiatives and what barriers these companies may be facing. Similarly, companies in Uganda are currently committing to the UNDP's Gender Equality Seal Certification Program. Many of these companies may not have the right skill set to reimagine their strategies and structure to better promote gender equality. However, their willingness to commit to this program creates an opportunity for ICRW to have a dialogue about their goals and what ICRW's role could be in helping to achieve them. And now, Sam will be discussing the changing aid paradigm.
Thank you, Lauren. So funding trends were an important topic of conversation during our stakeholder interviews, and I'll talk about a couple of the findings that came up. Common themes evolved from our discussions, including the increasing emphasis on trade being placed on by certain donor countries. In our interview with the Dutch ambassador to Uganda, he explained to us the reorientation of the Dutch aid cooperation model. The Dutch now have 3 classes of development cooperation. There's a pure aid relationship, which is the first one for low-income and low-capacity countries. The second level, however, places an increasing emphasis on trade integration, where the Dutch government places allows Dutch companies to import more to Uganda and Ugandan companies to export more to the Netherlands. The pace of the transition is based on the context and the improvement on the ground, and it remains to be seen just how rapidly the aid transformation with Uganda will take place. But eventually, the goal for the relationship is to get to something based on mutually beneficial trade, such as they have with South Africa and Nigeria. Another factor to consider when looking at a model such as this is the possible spread of something like it to other like European countries who may be facing pressure at home to cut their foreign aid budgets or to redivert some of the funds to deal with domestic crises, such as the Syrian refugee crisis. Regardless, the underlying theme from this meeting and many others was the increasing importance being placed on trade for the future growth prospects of Uganda. A second issue that came up was the not unexpected reissuance of the Mexico City policy. Mexico City policy, also known as the global gag rule, prevents any U.S. foreign aid money being dispersed to NGOs that have any sort of abortion language in their programming. Previous iterations of this policy had only affected a portion of U.S. funds set aside for family planning purposes, but this new version has extended the gag rule to all public health, development funds, health funds from all U.S. agencies. There are opportunities here for ICRW, however, provided they remain flexible enough to align their strategies. Women will be facing new challenges and opportunities in the growing private sector in Uganda, and ICRW can play a fundamental role in shaping the growing body of evidence as it relates to women's economic empowerment and their social equality. Partnerships with firms within the tradable goods sector can provide a win-win, especially for stakeholders who are looking to improve working conditions for women. And many of the programs and strategies that Lauren previously spoke about could be applicable here as well. And while the newest iteration of the Mexico City policy may prevent or limit the types of partners that ICRW can receive U.S. funds with, it also presents an opportunity because as a research and advocacy organization at the very nexus of gender and development, it is ideally placed to be able to do the kinds of research and evidence building on the resulting situation for women with this new Mexico City policy and advocate on their behalf worldwide. Because in one of our meetings, even before the full effect of the executive order was known, we had one official tell us it will be so much worse for women this time around because we are so much further along and they have so much more to lose. So these are just a few of the recommendations and a few of the sectors that we've been working with ICRW on this year. We look forward to submitting them the full report later. Thank you.
Yeah, a great report. Yeah, I have a question on corruption. Can you maybe speak more to organizational integrity, transparency, and versus a desire to stay in the country?
I think that's a tension that ICRW is going to have to grapple with. They're so new right now, but I think luckily they're also focused on having local staffing and engaging locally with grassroots organizations and other existing structures like that on a small scale. So I think in terms of defining their mission and maintaining the integrity, that will kind of flow organically from being engaged in those communities and focusing more on the service delivery side rather than, framing their objectives in a more overtly political sense. So I think it's all about, understanding what the priorities of the government are right now and how they're changing, and also maintaining good partnerships in Kampala.
Great job. I love the way that you diagnosed the stakeholders, and I love the way that you said to get traction, let's look at local government and coalitions on the ground. However, if we actually look at the political economy of this organization, there are those stakeholders you've described, there's the Ugandan government, and then there are the northern stakeholders, both the funders and the official ones. And it seems to me that the huge risk here is that what you end up with is that the powerful stakeholders are government and the northern stakeholders, and the outcome for this organization is what's known as isomorphic mimicry. You tell the story without actually getting any real traction, because traction is the weakest link. How would you advise this organization to avoid falling into that trap?
Thank you, Professor Levy. I took your class on governance, and so it very much informed my research. Well, one thing I think I took away from your class specifically was the difference between the spider systems and starfish systems. And the spider systems are controlled by the top, and it's definitely a reliance on northern powers and their objectives flowing down in a very hierarchical manner, versus starfish systems, which are more adaptive to local environments and kind of feed information from the ground to the top. So I think our recommendations are really based on trying to structure, as ICRW becomes acclimated to Uganda and the region, on more of a starfish system level. So that structure inherently is decentralized. And also, there are definitely other stakeholders to take into account, and we're reviewing those in our final report too. So it's a balancing act, and it also relies on communication systems and focusing on just a few key areas and not overreaching based on what the stakeholders at home in the north want ICRW to focus on. I don't know if others have other contributions.
Well, in your book, Working with the Grain by Brian Lee. No, I think that's exactly right, and it is a balance that you have to strike, especially as a new entrant in the area. And ICRW is not just looking to work in Uganda, but also Kenya and Tanzania and the whole region. So, I mean, of course, you have to work within the guidelines of whomever you're receiving money from, but it also, when you're applying whatever work you're trying to do so with the local context in mind.
And also, I see your point about isomorphic mimicry, because there will be an accountability issue to address in terms of what the structures are and what information is being fed from the donor organizations. But I think also accountability can be addressed in terms of the coalitions I was talking about. So engaging in a variety of other types of similar organizations, there will be a kind of checks and balances system that ensures that is kind of more addressed.
Sure, Louis Borston. How different is the approach going to be there from what they've done in India? And is the organization, how open is the organization to taking a very different approach, or is there a lot of culture that says there's the right way to do this?
I'll start.
Okay.
So with the programs that they have in India, they are hoping to recreate some of the ones that they've used in India and bring them to the Ugandan context, but they are being very sensitive to adapting them properly to this context.
I think the other thing to keep in mind with the Indian regional office, we interviewed the director there, and they're fundamentally coming from two different places. The Indian regional office existed before it was actually the Indian regional office, just managing projects that they had in India, whereas the Africa regional office is being put into place before even any projects are being conducted. So there's a little bit more freedom there to be able to choose and also try and find like partners with like missions in order to do research. Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Aniket Matra. I'm joined by my fellow teammates today, Ethan Green, Greg Weissman, and Ornella Kaze. Our project today is evaluating impact on the financial technology market in a demonetized India, and our research partner for this project was Quona, an impact investing firm based here in DC. This is just an overview of our project. You can follow along with the chevrons at the bottom. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, our research partner was Quona Capital, and Quona Capital is an impact investing firm, and essentially they manage a fund that invests in financial services for underbanked populations all across the world, and some of the largest contributors to their investments include large multinational corporations such as MasterCard and JP Morgan Chase. Now, the kind of central thesis of Quona is that investments within financial technology will improve financial inclusion. Our project consisted of basically looking at, our project consisted of designing a framework and a set of indicators that looked at the market level indirect impact of financial technology. And we did this looking at a specific portfolio client of Quona, specifically Neil Growth, which Greg will cover. Our research basically consisted of 20 plus surveys of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in specifically the Bandra West neighborhood of Mumbai, and we conducted a number of interviews with stakeholders in this process. And our research lasted around 2 weeks. So on November 8th, 2016, while in America we were paying attention to the US presidential election, another change was taking place in India, and this change was demonetization. And on the night of November 8th, Prime Minister Modi announced the demonetization of the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. And for those of you that might not know, this term has been thrown around a lot. Demonetization is the elimination and or replacement of currently existing money. Essentially, the demonetization process in India removed the 86% of the value of all notes in circulation and 24% of all notes in general. And essentially in this process, the 500 rupee note got replaced with a new 500 rupee note, and the 1,000 rupee note got replaced with a 2,000 rupee note. Now, Prime Minister Modi gave a number of justifications for why this took place. This included bringing more people into the tax structure in India, eliminating black money, reducing corruption, but the biggest issue we wanted to focus on was the promotion of financial inclusion. And how this process works is, or supposedly worked, was that by disincentivizing the use of cash, this created demand for financial technology, and as a result, more people were included within the financial system as a whole. We want to stress that this is part of an existing trend of financial opportunities. So the Indian government introduced the program called Aadhaar, which links essentially your fingerprint to bank accounts, as well as the Jan Dhan Yojana program, which was essentially to increase the number of bank accounts in the country. And here at the bottom, we have a number of key players which we believe will play a large role moving forward. So these are the results of our merchant surveys. So as you can see, a large percentage of the merchants that we interviewed are still based on cash. A number of merchants had what are called POS machines and smartphones. POS machines, for those of you that might not know, are point of sale machines. So these are basically just machines you can think of like as the ones that read your credit card and other machines that conduct such financial transactions. So a number of the merchants did have POS and smartphones, but this is still a low number. And through our merchant surveys, we saw that many of the businesses reported a downturn in sales, and this especially occurred due to the fact that there was major religious holidays in India. And many of the businesses depend on sales during that time. I'm going to leave it to Ornella now to go over the next section.
Thank you, Aniket. I will be going over Quona's impact framework and why it is important for our purposes. One thing to note about demonetization, it did not initiate the process of transitioning India into a digital economy. This trend was already in place through the initiatives that Aniket previously mentioned. Demonetization has simply accelerated the adoption of fintech by widening India's digital consumer base. Thus, it is critical for impact investors such as Kona Capital to monitor market trends in order to ensure that its portfolio clients remain competitive within the new digital landscape. This is Kona's current impact framework. It is a management tool for making performance-based decisions about their portfolio companies. As you can see, it highlights access, quality, and market performance indicators, which can be categorized into either direct or indirect impact. We were tasked specifically with identifying new strategies to measure indirect impact, which is often obscure and difficult to assess. This can also be done through market indicators, which determine the financial sector development of regulations, innovation, local talent, and business model scalability. During the product development cycle, companies must be mindful of employing a continuous customer feedback loop. This feedback loop allows you to employ an end-user-focused template in creating new products and services. During the second stage of the development cycle, data is collected either through randomized controls trials, informal surveys, as we did during our own research, and third-party contracts. Unfortunately, this model does not properly assess the mechanisms by which we can collect indirect impact. Our overall strategic goal was to develop a new framework by which Kona could analyze the data that falls into the impact framework so that they could monitor the way their portfolio clients develop their own market impact. This will be discussed further by Ethan. Now I'll pass it over to Greg, who will present a case study of one of Kona's clients.
Thank you, Ornella. So for our case study, we wanted to focus on one of Kona's two portfolio firms that are currently operating in India. NeoGrowth was founded in 2012 and has a mission that fits into Kona's goal of expanded financial services, in that it gives out loans to many of the merchants who we spoke with on the streets, micro, small, and medium-sized merchants, who have credit card receivables of at least 1 year. NeoGrowth's model helps financial inclusion, as certain lending firms can't reach merchants who don't have a history of using loans. So NeoGrowth's model is unique in that the payment schedule is not set by a strict bank, but rather it is set up based on how well the merchant is doing during that period, which is very vital for seasonal merchants. A normal NeoGrowth merchant has between $3,000 to $24,000 in sales on their card per month in rupees, of course, works in the food or the clothing business, and the loan has a tenor of around 15 months, but again, that is dependent on how well the merchant does during that time period. As you can see on the bottom, there are many challenges as well, but we believe that NeoGrowth is situated very well after the demonetization, except for the low levels of financial literacy, which will have to change to ensure future growth for NeoGrowth. In 2015, NeoGrowth started doing a social report to see the social returns on its loan by a third party. These are some of the results from a 2016 report done by the same third party. And while these are good at measuring the social returns at this level, we believe that they lack a way to measure the market level returns, which will be discussed now in our framework by Ethan.
Thank you, Greg. In order to support Kona Capital and its portfolio companies, we have developed a market impact assessment framework, which we refer to as the growth trifecta. The growth trifecta is comprised of 3 separate categories of activities which affect market growth: innovation, industry leadership, and knowledge sharing. Industry leadership refers to the extent to which companies participate and lead in their industry associations, partner with others in the sector, and engage with the government in order to encourage passing of supportive regulation. Knowledge sharing indicates the degree to which a company disperses information to the public or to its sector, either through blogs, formal research, media presence, or direct education of the customer base. Finally, a company's efforts to innovate, either at the product or operational level, will change the way the sector as a whole operates, ensuring that products regularly adapt to the changing needs of the market and therefore enhance the customer acquisition process. A company which engages in all three of these areas as dictated by their own market needs will play a role in enhancing the market space by attracting new investors and encouraging the development of a favorable regulatory environment. This model will enable both Quona Capital and its portfolio companies to regularly assess the extent to which they are addressing and impacting the market. The strength of our model lies in its applicability without requiring long-term or high-quality testing. As we apply this framework to neogrowth, given the context of the demonetized India described by Aniket, several key indicators and focus areas arise that for both Quona and neogrowth, which they should be monitoring on a regular basis. For industry leadership, at the top of the triangle, in order to adapt to the changing marketplace for fintech in India, it is recommended that neogrowth maintain direct contact with the government at all levels and leverage the power of industry associations in order to ensure continued policy momentum. For innovation, on the right, in order to ensure a strong market base, neogrowth must begin monitoring its efforts to innovate new customer service models in order to continually access and educate a resistant and hesitant client base. And finally, on the left, with regard to sharing knowledge, neogrowth must actively be sharing its successes and its failures as it attempts to adjust to the new market space. Especially, this is important with regard to areas surrounding financial literacy, namely customer acquisition, education, service, and retention. The monitoring of efforts in these three key areas will create a benchmark from which Quona Capital can use to evaluate neogrowth as an investment, and simultaneously it will provide neogrowth with a baseline of activity which it can use to adjust its strategy going forward. In order to ensure the success of this framework, it is recommended that Quona use neogrowth as a pilot to evaluate its applicability as an evaluative tool for existing investments, as well as a potential component of its screening process for new companies and investments. In order to do so, we recommend that Quona fold the growth trifecta into its existing reporting model in order to ensure that information and innovations flow from the ground up and reflect on-the-ground realities as accurately as possible. We believe by enabling analysis and strategy at both the investor and the investee levels, the growth trifecta will enable growth of the fintech sector, ensuring that forward momentum provided by demonetization will continue well into the future. Furthermore, the use of this model will allow Quona Capital to constantly evaluate its current investees and select new leaders in the fintech market, ensuring its continued success as a leading impact investor in the fintech field. Before we open for questions, we'd like to take a moment to extend a special thank you to Dr. Tanvi Nagpal, our advisor, Allison Harwood, the Quona Capital team represented here by Adam Hartman, and our friends Nish Bhutani and Tushar Thakkar in Mumbai, without whom none of this would have been possible. Thank you very much, and we'd love to take your questions. Great.
We answer.
Thank you. Great presentation. I think this is a question for you, Ethan.
Yes.
So when you were developing your trifecta, I'm sure you benchmarked and compared against indicators used by others active in this space. And I wonder if you would describe that process for us. Thank you.
Of course. So in looking at indirect impact, there are several models existing right now that have been put forward by incredibly high-level players in the field. JP Morgan has released several studies, the GIN impact. However, a lot of these studies and models currently really only look at areas of social impact. They focus on data acquisition from the field, not necessarily direct market impact. Market impact is actually very, as Ornella mentioned, very vague and hard to determine. And instead of looking at ways, either statistical or the RCT model, which is regularly touted as successful, and it is, but is also very time-consuming and very costly on the part of the company and the third-party research partner. We decided to take a different approach, which was to analyze current activities that were linked to market impact or market growth. So that's why we settled on those three. Our belief is that if a company is actually doing all three of those, instead of trying to parse out some invisible effect, which can be incredibly hard to do, you will be able to sort of have a proxy level of analyzing a company's impact on the market. So it's a new model that takes a new way of looking at progress going forward and on a continuous basis, as opposed to testing the impact of an innovation or a test after the fact. So that was how we switched. So because most of the work is after the effect or after the test, not before or ongoing.
So if I had some money and I wanted to invest in deepening financial inclusion in India, would I be better off putting my money into a social venture like the one you studied, or trying to figure out what needs to happen at the market level and trying to fund those types of activities? It sounds to me like you've got a venture that's both trying to do its own thing but also trying to work at the market level. And I'm wondering if there are multiple ventures that doing that same thing, maybe there's things to do that would support all of those ventures rather than just go venture by venture.
That is a very good question. Thank you.
So I think if I were to recommend one thing that we heard throughout all of our meetings, and if you make a lot of money, my name is right here if you want to send some back. But with all these financial things that are going off of cash and online, the securities for those firms is going to be a huge investment opportunity. So that's one thing that we mentioned, is that as more people put in their cash into bank accounts, which may not have securities right now, in these sectors, they're going to need some security. So all the security firms in that part of the world will need to have some investors like yourselves.
There are also several other components to look at. As new policies are passed regularly, there are going to be new players emerging constantly, particularly those which focus on customer financial literacy education are going to be important, because the majority of the Indian economy or the Indian population is not explicitly financially literate in the way that using a mobile app or a lot of fintech will require. So it's important that companies are willing to work with their clients step by step and also provide security mechanisms like Greg mentioned, but more on the personal security side, so payment tracking mechanisms. There are several trends like that that will continue into the future as well.
Okay, my name is Allison Harwood, and so I'll try to answer this too. If I understood your question, I think the idea here was that any Quona wants an investee company that is going to do the best that it can to grow and develop and give them a good return, but it wants something in addition to that, and that was really what the team was trying to do, was to look at how their investee companies can also help the marketplace grow beyond their own operations. And that's why these particular elements would mean that NeoGrowth should be doing as much as it can so that access is improving and quality is improving and it's growing, but it's doing things that are helping the entire marketplace to grow more as well.
I guess it occurs to me there may be some things that could be done that are not through a venture like that. So it sounds like, for example, consumer education is really important in this market.
Correct.
Because there will be a lot of people asking poor people for their money, and they may, some of those people may lose your money or steal your money.
Right.
So maybe there's a role for an NGO or somebody there to really up the consumer education, which could, if your goal is to have a social impact, might give you more bang for your buck than investing at this point in another social venture.
That's certainly a possibility. Based on our research and conversations with the Quona team and other impact investors, as well as Paytm and MSwipe, two of the fintech companies operating right now, They're actually, so far to date, in terms of government efforts to provide financial literacy education in a typical classroom model, as well as nonprofits, even some private sector companies have tried to do this, and there hasn't actually been a very strong ROI. Consumers have not left those trainings feeling more financially literate. They've actually felt, in some cases, more confused because now they're more broadly aware of how much there is to understand. So that's why it's important that companies themselves take an active role in educating their client base directly, be that through an agent model where you're physically there with the person. Chatbots are regularly touted as possible ventures as well to look into. But there are several different models that you could look into, but it's really, our belief is that it has to be the strong in-person business-to-customer relationship that needs to be advanced. Thank you.
Oops. All right. Hello, everyone. What? You all right? Oh, no problem. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Corinne Hogacher. This is Brittany Grable, Sarah Pacini, and Arti Srivastava. And this year, we worked with GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. So GAIN is interested in becoming a global leader on issues surrounding urban nutrition. So to sort of look into that and do some scoping work with them, what we did was we conducted work this year around issues surrounding urban nutrition in Delhi, India, including a 2-week fieldwork this January. So first, Arti is going to tell you a little bit about why we chose this issue.
Okay, great. Thank you, Corinne. So before we actually delve into the presentation proper, I would like to spend 30 seconds on trying to explain why is actually urban nutrition a big problem. So as we know, urbanization is happening at a breakneck speed in all the developing cities. There's this tide of rural migrants moving from villages to the urban centers. This, as a result, creates constraints, space constraints. There are informal clusters. People don't have access to water. This, as a result, leads to a constraint on infrastructure and hygiene facilities. This contributes to the disease environment, which in turn has repercussions for nutrition. Another key trend that we observed was the proliferation of processed food availability in urban centers. People don't have time. People are always on the go in urban cities. They want something quick, convenient, which is not only unhealthy, but is also very unhygienic. And we have some very horror stories for that too as well. Another urban trend that we observed and confirmed was the nutritional double burden. In families, you could have certain family members who are actually obese, while certain family members are malnourished. So these are some of the emerging trends in urban cities, and this is the core focus of our project, and we will delve into this into these themes throughout the next presentation. Thank you.
So in order for GAIN to be equipped to respond to this growing need, our team has developed a standard operating procedure for rapid appraisals of urban nutrition. So this is a flexible research tool intended to support GAIN in the formative problem definition phase of program design. It can be used to identify key intervention points, map out partners, and pinpoint the challenges that should be explored in further inquiry. And to better conceptualize this really expansive space of urban nutrition, which we know affects so many different areas of people's lives, we break it down into 4 key thematic areas, starting at the very most broadest level of the policy and governance framework that affects nutrition, then narrowing in on the value chain for fresh fruits and vegetables, then the food environment, and finally down to the individual consumer. And in our presentation today, we're going to walk you through these 4 areas through a case study of Delhi, India.
So mixed through our presentation, you're going to see a lot of wonderful photos, which form part of our qualitative research, and those were all taken by our team member, Sarah.
Thank you. So as our team mentioned, there are a range of issues facing urban areas today, and we did have to narrow our scope down a little bit. So our research question was to really understand the influences and challenges that low-income Delhiites face in consuming sufficient amounts of nutritious fruits and vegetables. So our target population earns between 10 and 15,000 rupees per month. So they are not the poorest of the poor, bottom of the pyramid, but they're about one step up. These individuals tend to work as drivers, as domestic help, as parking lot attendants. And while they are definitely resource constrained, they do have a bit of purchasing power in the market, and they do have a bit of choice in what they eat. So I'm going to pass it back to Brittany, and she's going to walk us through the policy and governance thematic area.
Great. So starting with the key findings in governance, the most important thing to understand in terms of governance in Delhi is that it's not only a city, it's also sort of a state. And this causes unique challenges in terms of policymaking and governance. GAIN was particularly interested in the potential for municipal and city governments to be leaders in urban nutrition policy. One of our key findings in Delhi is that the municipal government lacks the policy space, which was a common phrase we were told by our interviewees, to really lead in this area. Whereas in other states in India, in other cities in India, the municipal government may have this more of a role in this area. Because Delhi has a state government whose borders overlap with that of the city, many of those functions that the city government could take are actually under the state government role. And so the second key finding in terms of government is that within the policies that are implemented, the actors are very siloed. So we know that nutrition is a multi-sectoral sphere that affects everything from health, education, and just daily purchasing by consumers. And because of this, Delhi is not unique in the sense that actors in nutrition are very often very siloed. But something that we often heard from our stakeholders is that nutrition is everybody's baby, so it's nobody's baby. And it really gets lost in all of this, especially given the complicated levels of governance in Delhi. While other states and cities in Delhi have state or city nutrition missions bringing together all of these separate actors, no such efforts exist in Delhi, and there's a strong need for this coordinating mechanism. Finally, I just want to highlight that the policies that are implemented in Delhi face numerous implementation challenges, the most critical of which we found was chronic understaffing and under-resourcing. So there's just one example. The state food safety commissioner, who's pictured here, is supposed to have at least 30 food inspectors to help her to monitor every single street vendor in the entire city of Delhi. Instead, she only has 6 right now. And so on the next slide, if can move on. This is just a map that we did of the governance actors in Delhi. And I'm not going to go through this in detail right now, but the key thing that I want to highlight first is the vertical. If you look at it vertically, the different columns, this is where the siloing happens. So every policy is the realm of a different department of government. The second thing I want to highlight is that all of the policies that are implemented in Delhi are very top-down. Policy making happens at the central level, and implementation flows down. And next, RT is going to lead us through the value chain in Delhi.
Great. So, as part of the research, we had to do a value chain assessment of fresh fruits and vegetables in Delhi. So these are some of the key trends that we observed. So in Delhi itself, physical availability is not an issue. There is a very well-oiled mechanism of wholesale mandis, which are the wholesale markets, sub-mandis, as well as the ultimate retailer, if you will, which is the thelewala, as we call in India, or the push cart guy, who basically loads his little push cart with vegetables and fruits and goes on to, sorry, is that okay? Yeah. Okay, and goes and sells it in residential areas. So availability is not an issue. And also, as one of the quotes from Satnam Singh, who is the Agricultural Produce Marketing Secretary, he told us, if the demand is there, the supply will definitely follow in Delhi. Value chains tend to be very long with many actors. Produce tends to exchange many hands, and there are a lot of commission agents, as you can see, and aggregators who basically want a price cut of the eventual produce. Another key finding was that wastage is surprisingly not a major issue in the food system. Now, I'm not talking about post-harvest loss. I'm not talking about when it reaches your plate. I'm talking about in the Delhi system as well. There's very little wastage and everything is sort of utilized, and we will talk about this later. This is the map that we drew out, the stakeholder mapping. I'm not going to detail, But some of the key things I want to highlight is, as you can see, it's long. There are many actors. You have a lot of commission agents and even unregulated middlemen who are basically controlling the supply and taking a portion of the commission. They also have the most market power, as indicated by the darker boxes. Thank you. That is Corinne.
Great. So now that brings us to the deli food environment. And just so we're all working off the same definition, the food environment refers to the landscape of factors that influence your choice to choose one food over another. So for example, the types of retail outlets that are around you, the types of food that they have, the advertisements and deals and promotions that are nudging you to make this choice over that one, and the information you have about your food as you're making the decision. So we looked at each of these different aspects of the food environment during our research and in our report, but right now I'm going to touch on two of them. The first one being affordability, so price. As you can imagine, for our target group, price is the #1 concern when they are making a food choice. It is very difficult to say anything definitive about the prices of all fruits and vegetables in Delhi, but we did learn two things. The first thing that we learned is that there is incredibly high price volatility, even for the most commonly consumed fruits and vegetables, such as onions, potatoes, tomatoes. It's very common for them to double in price or more between the high season and the low. And this tells us that a family that might be nutrition secure in one season might not be in the next. The other thing that we found is that there's an incredibly high retail markup, 60 to 80% over the wholesale price. As Arti showed us with our map of the value chain, food coming into the Delhi food system exchanges many hands and goes through many intermediaries. And due to this, we identified the food entryway as a point of where there's a lot of scope for increasing market competition and reducing those consumer prices. The second point I want to touch on is the street vendors. So there is an increasing demand in Delhi for delicious, cheap, quick, convenient food, especially among our target population who tend to be very time poor, and we will talk about that more in a second. But the issue with street vendors that comes up again and again is hygiene and food safety. For example, one of the concerns is the quality of the ingredients used in the street food. So there are lots of stories of vendors going to hotels in the morning and purchasing used cooking oil that they will then use throughout the day. And we know that every time they heat up that cooking oil, it becomes more toxic and more dangerous for people to consume. So we've identified street vendors and the supporting infrastructure and regulatory environment as another potential area for intervention that could have a huge impact on nutrition in Delhi.
All right, so next I'm going to move on to consumers. We looked at how consumer knowledge, attitudes, and practices will also affect our nutrition status. So starting out with awareness, we heard from a lot of the experts that awareness in Delhi about nutrition is very low. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that people don't know that fresh fruits and vegetables are healthy, but it rather means that they're lacking any deeper knowledge, for example, like the causes and effects of serious micronutrient deficiency like anemia, which affects 60% of children in Delhi. We delved a little deeper into a specific gap in awareness, which is complementary feeding. So that's the WHO recommends that at 6 months you stop exclusively breastfeeding infants and you start introducing other foods. But what do those foods look like? We found that in our target population in Delhi, mothers don't know what food groups, how much, what kinds of foods that their infants should be getting. And actually, according to stats that just came out, only 4% of infants in Delhi are actually receiving adequate complementary feeding between 6 and 24 months. But then we move on to the next idea, which is behavior. So even if your target population does know what healthy food looks like, they may not make the choice to eat that, and they may not make the choice to feed their families healthy foods. And that's intimately tied with time poverty, especially in a context like Delhi, where people are working very long hours to make ends meet. If they have 1 extra hour in the day, they have to decide whether or not they're going to spend that cooking healthy food or they're going to buy that street food, which is quick, tasty, and delicious. So the last point I wanted to touch on relating to consumers is this idea that of vulnerable groups. So you probably have an idea maybe of what a slum in India looks like, what the housing looks like, what kind of services they have, what they might be eating. But that's basically totally a myth. All slums are not created equal, and especially in Delhi, Depending on where you live, you may have totally different access to services. You may or may not have electricity, you may or may not have water, and you may or may not even have education, and all of the things that come with that. And this is tied to this idea of differential citizenship. Who you are and where you live sort of actually affects what your rights are as a citizen. So in India, everyone below the poverty line by law is guaranteed access to the public distribution system, which should give you subsidized and free food grains. But if you don't have the national ID card, which is Aadhaar, you actually wouldn't have access to that public distribution system, which obviously changes the whole calculus surrounding nutrition for you. So that's the end of our key findings from our report, summarized here by Sarah, who's going to tell us a little bit more about where we went from there.
Great. So throughout our interviews and our research, we identified a number of intervention areas and intervention activities. There are 6 selected on the screen for you. I'm not going to go through them, but please feel free to ask about them during the Q&A. Identifying these different activities was step 1. The next steps would be to convene stakeholders in Delhi to understand where their interests are and where the political will for change might be, as well as to conduct a deeper dive into any one intervention to do a bit of feasibility study, targeting, and a cost-benefit analysis. And of course, while no one intervention would solve all of Delhi's nutrition challenges, we really believe that this kind of multi-sectoral approach and casting a wide net holds a promise for tackling the unique urban challenges that Delhi is facing in the nutrition space.
All right, whoops, sorry. So what actually came out of our collaboration with GAIN this year was not just one product, but 2. So first we had our summarizing key takeaways, possible intervention points from our scoping work in Delhi. But we also have created a replicable model, which is the SOP that we mentioned before. We're hoping that this guide will lay out a process for rapid assessment of a city's nutritional status that will be adaptable to cities around the world. Thank you so much for your attention, and we'd love to hear your questions.
Hi, I'm Teal Yalch from GAIN. I had the pleasure of working with all these lovely ladies. Thank you so much for your presentation, and we're looking forward to the report. So just a short question. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the activities that are actually occurring in Delhi to improve nutrition and food safety.
Sure, I'll start. Just thank you for the question. So we painted sort of a bleak picture, I think, but it is true that while the municipal government is very sidelined, there are some efforts in the state government to improve nutrition. One that we really want to highlight and that came up again as a really feasible intervention point is around street vending. So as my colleagues have mentioned, this is something that reaches so many people in Delhi. It's a really common way for people, especially in our target income group, to access food. And there's been some really innovative work done with both the Delhi State Food Commissioner as well as the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, which is the national sort of like the FDA of India, working with a really small grassroots organization called the National Street Vendors Association of Street Vendors in India, or NASFI, who we had the pleasure of meeting with. So they're actually training street vendors on safety and hygiene practices. They've trained, I think, 22,000 street vendors so far in Delhi, which has been really successful. And they're trying to promote it more by providing those who have gone through the training with certificates as well as aprons to help market themselves as healthier, safer street vendors. And this is an area that the state government of Delhi is actually, there's a lot of policy champions we found in this space who are interested in growing this further. I don't know if you guys add anything.
Hi, Raul Roman. I'm very happy to see Brittany, Artie, and Sarah and Corinne here. You did a great presentation. And I heard the word rapid assessment. And I'm dying to know more about it, particularly its usefulness and feasibility. Thank you.
So I think I could start there. As we may have learned in Professor Roman's class, what a rapid assessment is meant to be is an initial scoping exercise where you bring in a team of researchers, ideally from multidisciplinary backgrounds, and you're sort of trying to get an idea of the lay of the land and where you're going to do further research. And it's primarily with qualitative methods and usually around 2 weeks, which is exactly what we did in New Delhi. So we used qualitative methods. We went in, and we'd like to think that we're from a multidisciplinary background. So we took what we did, which we thought was sort of fit into this rapid, it's often rapid rural appraisal, but we've sort of adapted it to an urban setting. And we're hoping that we can sort of pass on the torch for other teams to be able to do the same sort of rapid appraisal. And we're not trying to tell people exactly what program to make. Our goal was rather to sort of, like, as we said, a scoping exercise to find areas for further research, areas you might want to look more into and do more research on.
I think that was great. And I would maybe add that we used some few other tools that we learned in class in our literature review and analysis of different kinds of literature, both direct information, gray literature, and in our interviews before and after our field visit to validate our information.
I think one of the caveats is it definitely needs to be adapted to a local context. I mean, it's a very high-level guidelines, and definitely each country is going to be different. Jakarta, Rio de Janeiro, they're all very different. So it's we've tried to be very as comprehensive as possible. Like, these are the other things you could look at, but we were unable to do, but you can possibly look at. So we've all tried to detail that, but it'll definitely have to be a little bit more localized when it's actually rolled out. Yeah.
What do I do here? Yeah, how do you, that? Do you know? Oh, there. What's happening? Is it this one? No, that's a laser pointer. There we go. All right, everyone. We are the WWF China and Kenya teams. Sorry, I'll speak into the mic. I'm Krishan Raghavan, and these are my colleagues, Mercy Angwa, Laura Kwang, Anshi Guan, Lemuel Robinson, Himat Sanlu, and Maria Conde. And our project focused on promoting trade and investment in green products between China and Kenya, so looking at environmentally friendly goods and services. And we'll take you through our research today. So the overall goal of our project was to develop a business case for increasing Chinese consumption and investment in green goods and services. And this is to be used for advocacy at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And basically the idea behind the project was to sort of diversify the current pattern of trade between China and Africa, which is at the moment heavily focused on high-impact industries and extractives, and reorient that a little bit towards areas with a more positive environmental impact. And we looked at 3 different value chains: ecotourism, distributed renewable energy, and organic tea. So you might have seen on the previous slide, there was a China team and a Kenya team, but then we will be presenting today by value chain. So Mercy and I worked on ecotourism, Anshi, Laura, and Lemuel worked on DRE, and Maria and Himat worked on organic tea. And we undertook very similar research methods on both sides. Literature reviews, field interviews with stakeholders across a number of sectors in China and in Kenya. To give you an overview of our field research, it was a 2-week period in Beijing, China for the China team, and Nairobi, Mombasa, and the Masai Mara in Kenya for the Africa team. And we basically sat down with a number of different stakeholders. You can see we spoke with government, the private sector, research institutes, so on, to get a better understanding of their engagement with the sector and their perceptions of Chinese involvement or Kenyan involvement, African involvement on the other side. So starting with ecotourism, Mercy will give us an overview. And this is a picture of us talking to people about ecotourism in the field. Very on brand. You'll see the logo on the left side.
Thank you, Krishnan. So as Krishnan mentioned, one of the markets that we analyzed was ecotourism. So the International Ecotourism Society defines ecotourism as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment and improves the well-being of the local people. So based on this definition, we can see that there are three components to ecotourism. There's the economic component, the environmental component, and the social component. So whereas ecotourism in Kenya follows this standard, ecotourism in China is a relatively newer concept and currently has about 60 different definitions. So based on these divergent definitions and regulations, we focus our report more on the environmental component of ecotourism, which both sides have more in common. So Krishnan will now present the first part of our market findings.
So I'll be speaking on the positive side about some findings that support the potential of this market as a prospect for investment and as a source of, and for consumption, so as an attractive area for Chinese tourists. So as you can see from these graphs here, there are strong growth prospects. So on the one hand, we have demand. We see Chinese outbound tourism between 1994 and 2011 has really taken off in the latter half of the 2000s. So there's an increasing number of tourists who are going abroad, and that's really good for the Kenyan market, especially since many of these tourists are now seeking independent options and are looking for more interesting and diverse alternatives. There's greater environmental awareness among these tourists, so there's a possibility of increasing demand for ecotourism, and there's also a greater tendency towards independence rather than large organized group tours, which are a little bit more challenging to incorporate with ecotourism low-impact principles. And then on the Kenyan market, some of the key strengths of Kenya as a tourist destination are really well-developed tourism infrastructure and offerings. Tourism is a very important source of revenue for the Kenyan economy, so there's a ton of policy support from the government as well, and they invest heavily in marketing Kenya abroad as an attractive destination, so there's strong support from the government as well. And there's a very well-developed ecotourism regulation and standardization regime in the country. It's been present since 1994, so there's a lot of awareness around these standards. And then particularly in a regional context, the standards are quite well-developed. And in terms of the market for investment, you can kind of see here on the right side that due to a number of political events in the past few years, the Kenyan market has really sort of come down in terms of tourist arrivals and earnings. But based on our research, we see this is the government has invested heavily in improving some of the security issues and political issues that have led to violent incidents that have maybe driven away tourists in recent years. So we see the market as having bottomed out and with very strong growth prospects for investors.
Thank you, Krishnan. Through our studies, we also discovered certain weaknesses certain challenges, in the form of weaknesses and threats to the ecotourism market. On the side of weaknesses and the Kenyan side, the main issue was that there was a lack of comprehensive ecotourism awareness among Kenyan service providers. Some service providers we spoke to were only aware of and practiced certain aspects of ecotourism instead of the unified whole, and some others were also unwilling to take on certain environmental upgrades in compliance with ecotourism standards, despite the long-term benefits this would have for their businesses. On the Chinese side, there was also the similar issue of insufficient general awareness of ecotourism among Chinese people in general. So this makes it difficult to garner interest in ecotourism offerings abroad among most Chinese travelers. under threats, the main issue on the Kenyan side was the perception of underdevelopment and insecurity in the country. This is due to past instances of political instability and terrorism within the country, as well as the perception of Kenya as an underdeveloped African country, which together reduce Chinese tourist attraction in Kenya as a tourist destination. And finally, the major threat on the Chinese side was the nature of Chinese travel, which created low demand for ecotourism offerings. Chinese travel is usually characterized by large groups who stay for short periods of time, usually just to sightsee. Ecotourism facilities, on the other hand, are more small scale and cannot accommodate such large groups. They also encourage longer periods of stay in order to fully engage with the local environment. So Krishnan will now present our recommendations based on these findings.
So these are our policy recommendations to 4 major stakeholder groups, just on some small measures that could have a significant impact on improving the bilateral market for tourism services and investment. So starting with the government of Kenya, a key measure would be to strengthen regulation. Right now, these are done by an independent industry association rather than the government. And although the government has a rating system for facilities, it doesn't really incorporate environmental standards. So the government could strengthen uptake and legitimacy of the standards by putting its backing behind them, or at least incorporating environmental considerations into its existing standardization framework. Marketing ecotourism specifically in China, the government has undertaken a very significant effort to market Kenya as a destination in China, and has quite an ambitious goal of attracting 1 million Chinese tourists to Kenya over the next few years. But it's been more generalized rather than focused on offerings like sustainability and ecotourism, and it also hasn't done much to address some of the safety concerns potential Chinese tourists have, which Mercy touched on, and also making sure marketing is specifically targeted towards groups that are more likely to engage in independent travel. So this is primarily young, white-collar urban professionals. And one suggestion we had from our client, actually, which we plan to incorporate into the final findings, is to increase marketing around specific Chinese holidays, so Labor Day, the Chinese New Year, and Chinese National Day, to sort of increase the number of tourists coming then. And then on the government of China side, something that would be really beneficial would be for the government to promote a single and comprehensive definition of ecotourism to sort of counteract these various narratives regarding what exactly constitutes ecotourism floating around China. It would be helpful for the tourism authority to propagate a single narrative for clarity. On the Kenyan private sector side, we believe the Industry Association for Ecotourism should do a better job of selling the value proposition of ecotourism, of adopting ecotourism standards. So pointing out some of the long-run cost savings that can result from converting to an eco-certified facility in terms of energy, waste management, et cetera. And also working more to engage Chinese investors in the sector. Right now, there's a lot of Chinese consumption, but for example, Mercy and I traveled to the Masai Mara, a major tourist destination, and most people there were only able to point us to a single hotel that had Chinese investment, although there are maybe hundreds and hundreds of hotels in the Masai Mara. And then on the Chinese private sector side, we wanted to encourage Chinese tour operators to develop stronger partnerships with with operators in Kenya. Right now, the cost of travel to Africa is a major barrier for many Chinese tourists, and we think developing stronger linkages with their Kenyan counterparts could help to address that as a barrier to expanded Chinese tourism. So next we'll move on to distributed renewable energy. So we'll hear from Anchi, Laura, and Lemuel.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura, and here are my colleagues, Anchi and Lemuel. So we are the distributed renewable energy team, and Anchi and Lemuel went to Beijing, China, and I went to Nairobi, Kenya. And here today we focus primarily on mini-grids market. Okay, first of all, here's a brief summary of Kenya market. So the renewable energy sector in Kenya is among the most active in Africa. And that's largely due to lack of significant domestic reserves of fossil fuel. And so the major energy sources in Kenya are geothermal and hydro. However, current installed mini-grid sites are overwhelmingly dominated by diesel-based plants. And even for the hybridized mini-grids, the proportion of renewable generation is below 15%. And mini-grids are basically sites usually in towns that are in the remote area. They're usually too far or too expensive to reach for the national grid. So the map on your right-hand side is the current and planned national grid system. Clearly, the national grid is focused on the circled area, and therefore that leaves a substantial room for mini-grids to come in. And another issue with mini-grids is that the expensive upfront costs. Although there are studies that show even with higher upfront costs, renewable mini-grids can still be cheaper over a project lifetime due to higher operational costs of traditional diesel-based plants. Then we also identified a few key challenges in Kenya. From institutional level, Kenya authorities recognize the importance to improve energy access in rural areas in order to achieve national development goals, such as Kenya Vision 2030. However, such efforts to improve access to energy access has been primarily focused on grid extension, as we see in the previous slide. So the mini-grid development has been slow due to limited funding, lack of private sector engagement, and lack of government leading, and particularly in upfront investments. And apart from that, from consumers' perspective, during our interviews, many rural residents were not sure, hesitate to use mini-grids because they're not sure when the grid may come. And they do not know that mini-grids can be affordable and reliable. So they only choose mini-grids when the alternatives are not available. And the picture on the right is a model presented by PowerGen, which is a leading renewable mini-grid company based in Nairobi. And this model basically explains and it provides a possible solution to make mini-grid compatible to national grid. Therefore, the consumers won't bear any risks even if the national grid comes. And from now, I'll hand it over to my colleague Anqi, who will walk through Chinese involvement in the market.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to present China's involvement in Kenya and the and the main challenges that Chinese companies are facing. So since the year 2000, China has become the largest trading partner of Africa, and the Chinese government extended Chinese companies' engagement in Africa through the Going Abroad policy, One Belt, One Road initiative, FOCAC meeting, and many other policies. In the 2015 FOCAC meeting, the two sides decided to strengthen their strategic partnership in the energy sector, which is through a $10 billion investment support through the China-Africa Development Fund and Special Fund for SMEs. And also they established the economic and trade cooperation zones in 6 Africa countries to eliminate trade barriers. And based on our field research in Beijing, we also identified some main challenges that Chinese companies are facing in the mini-grid market. First is the lack of DRE product standard and certification system. Our interviews with the Chinese producers revealed that Kenya importers only source cheap products, but the products are usually poorly designed and assembled, which negatively affect the reputation of Chinese products and makes it harder for Chinese companies to conduct business there. And the second one is a lack of understanding in the Kenya market. Chinese companies, especially SMEs, has extremely limited access to the business information in Kenya. Without knowing about the local electricity capacity and the local environmental regulation, they're not able to project their potential risks and returns, as well as find reliable local partners, which block many of them to expand their business. And the third one is lack of human resources for off-grid projects. Chinese companies face a lack of qualified local workers and technicians to operate and maintain the machinery. And the proper training of local labor would be both time-consuming and costly. This problem also prevents some advanced technologies from entering the Kenya market. And above are our China side research findings, and Lemuel is going to present our policy recommendation.
Hey everyone. So for the next part, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our policy recommendations for China and Kenya, and then from there we'll go on to organic tea. So on the Kenya side, we believe that the Kenyan government should emphasize the development of solar mini-grids in addition to their current electrification projects. The benefit here would be that Kenyan communities and rural areas, especially the more remote ones, would have access to more reliable electric sources, and they could also kind of tailor the output for these systems to their needs as a community in terms of size. On the next part, we believe that the private sector should be included more in this process because currently the electrification projects are done mostly through public and multilateral funding. If you include the private sector, you can kind of supplement this funding, and you can also make it possible for more efficient, newer mini-grids to enter the market, which would possibly be more compatible with the electrical grid itself. Through improved consumer awareness, Kenyan consumers would be able to find products that suit their needs and also suit their budget. And that would also make it more likely for them to make better decisions in the market and use these products in the future. Through product certifications, the Kenyan government would be able to control kind of the products and shepherd the quality that you find in the market because currently there aren't really any controls to that. And that's part of the problem that the Kenyan market has is that customers don't trust what's on the market, but they usually just go for what they can get. So moving to the China side, through the expansion of risk-sharing programs, Chinese companies that are interested in going to Kenya would be able to take out reinsurance policies, which would help them to make profits sooner and also help them to absorb the risks and the uncertainty that's associated with transferring to a new continent. Through the development of more inducive investment plans, these companies would be able to access longer-term, lower-interest plans that would help them to start sales and operations in Kenya, and it would make them more profitable as companies in general. And then through the provision of legal support, companies in China that want to go to Kenya would have access to support that teaches them about differences in business culture between China and Kenya. And also they'd be able to register their businesses with the Kenyan government. And then they would have more ease in finding labor and also finding business contacts in Kenya itself. And lastly, through the establishment of certification from the Chinese side, products that are going from China to Kenya, these products would be more trustworthy for consumers in Kenya because that's a problem that they have now where consumers don't know what they're getting, but they don't really trust Chinese products. If we want to increase the volume of Chinese trade with Kenya, we need to kind of improve this relationship. So thank you. And from here, we'll go to Hima and Maria when we talk about organic tea.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Maria, and this is Himat, and we focused our work on the potential for increased trade of and investment in organic tea between China and Kenya. As part of this work, Himat traveled to both Mombasa and Nairobi, and I traveled to Beijing. We identified organic tea as a sector for increased trade and investment for the strengths presented by the Kenyan tea supply and Chinese tea consumption. In addition to that, organic tea presents the promise of higher earnings for farmers and many environmental and health benefits. Firstly, Kenya is the world's third largest tea producer and the largest exporter. The country's tea industry developed under British colonial rule, mostly to supply foreign markets, and that continues to be the case today. In 2015, Kenya exported 95% of its tea. As a pivotal sector in the country, it provides for the livelihoods of 10% of the Kenyan population and contributes 4% to the country's GDP. Kenya relies primarily on a bulk tea export
model. Both large plantations and smallholders play a key role in the supply chain. While it uses fertilizers, Kenya's tea is pesticide-free. Part of Kenya's tea has been certified under various voluntary sustainability standards, such as Fair Trade and UTZ. At the moment, the most popular standard in Kenya is Rainforest Alliance, and the process of certification has been mostly led by demand of export markets such as Europe. Kenya's tea sector also features a strong governance structure with research and regulating bodies. For example, the Kenya Tea Board is responsible for registering tea growers and also promoting Kenyan tea abroad. On the other side of the world, we have China, which was one of the first countries to embrace the art of drinking tea, and it is the largest consumer of tea in the world by volume. And tea consumption is growing. It rose by 10.6% from 2004 to 2014, and while green tea is the most popular at the moment, black tea, like the one we have in Kenya as well, will see its annual growth in consumption increase by more than 15% until 2024. Tea in China, which has a very mature and highly specialized market, also commands very high prices. Some specialty teas in China can cost more than their weight in gold. A lot of money. China is also a large tea importer. In 2015, 33% of its tea imports came from Sri Lanka, 15% from India, and 2.5% from Kenya. The beverage and food sector in China is also seeing growing popularity of organic products, and these are products that are grown without chemical fertilizers or pesticides. China's own organic label and standard, which you can see over there, was launched in 2004, and the market for organic products has tripled in sales since 2007. This has been driven mostly by rising incomes, high-profile food safety scares, and global health food trends. When it comes to tea, reports of toxic and harmful pesticides in Chinese tea are also driving consumers towards organic choices. Like specialty tea, organic products also command a price premium. Prices for organic products, as we confirmed during our trip in Beijing, can range from 3 to 15 times the price of conventional products. Given the increased demand for black tea on the Chinese side, as well as the greater awareness of food safety issues, also on the Chinese consumer side, combined with the ease of conversion to organic practices in Kenya, we believe this is a key sector to target to increase economic cooperation between China and Kenya.
Thank you, Maria. I'm Himmat. As Maria just highlighted, this clearly is a great opportunity for greater trade and greater production of organic tea in Kenya, primarily focused at the Chinese market. Through our research, we identified that in order to realize this potential, there are 4 key areas that require immediate action, namely organic certification systems in both countries, regionally as well, investment and value addition in the tea sector in Kenya, trade agreements and tariffs between the 2 countries, and a common theme that actually can cut across all our sectors is greater market linkages. So let's just go through them one by one. For the benefit of those in the front row who might not be able to see at the bottom, that's where we've listed out some of the key stakeholders for each of the recommendations. I'm sure you'll be able to get them as we discuss them, but in case you're trying to figure out what those boxes are. Right. So organic certification, as Maria highlighted earlier, there've been a number of lapses in food safety in China that has led to increased mistrust in food safety-related labels, and the organic label is also included in that category. This not only impacts general food safety, but it also has a very negative impact on the products that are adopting these labels and the market for those products themselves. Additionally, for any country to export an organic product to China, it has to be co-certified by the Chinese authorities as well, which involves a high time as well as an economic cost involving flying in of inspectors who inspect your land, go through a certification process, and a cost of $3,000 to $7,000 depending on the product. In Kenya, simultaneously, or East Africa in general, there have been certain steps made in coming up with an organic product standard, primarily one led by UNEP, or rebranded as UN Environment, in 2007 when they came up with the East Africa Organic Product Standard. This standard is applicable across 7 countries, including Kenya, and has seen a lot of uptake, primarily for domestic consumption. But since Kenya's tea is primarily an export market and the East African standard is fairly new, the Kenyan tea farmers have to rely on one of 5 international players for their organic certification to be accepted across the globe, which has in turn led to low adoption of organic standards in Kenya, with only 0.15% of the total production certified as organic, which roughly comes to 350 metric tons, which is nothing compared to the 400 million that the country is producing. And recommendations to actually tackle these, one of the biggest recommendations we could come up with was honestly to come up with co-branding initiative and co-recognition, which seems to be happening across the board with organic certifications and mutually recognizing each other's. In order to address the mistrust as well as the need for double certification, co-recognizing the Chinese organic label with certain international authorities, such as maybe the USDA or SOIL, as well as the East African label would be a positive step in ensuring that there's standardization across both countries. Additionally, in order to tackle the bottlenecks towards greater adoption of organic cultivation practices in Kenya, in the Kenyan tea sector, we have recommended that industry bodies as well as organic certification agencies actually address this area of concern and figure out what are the key bottlenecks that are leading to lower adoption of organic certifications. Next comes investment and value addition. Even though Kenya is the 3rd largest producer of tea and the largest exporter, only 2% of the total tea grown in Kenya is actually packaged, branded, and sold in retail, ready for retail formats. As a result, other than the fact that there's limited recognition of the fact that a lot of the tea you're drinking these days comes from Kenya, there's obviously a huge opportunity here to set up industry, which leads to job creation, wealth creation as well. And we recognize that private investors as well as the government need to focus on improving the value addition sector and industrialization of the tea sector in Kenya, and moving from this bulk export model, which has been in place ever since the origins of the tea industry, towards a more retail-ready model. That a great example of that is actually Sri Lanka, and we'll look at that in the next slide as well. Third thing that we want to cover are the trade agreements and tariffs. Kenyan tea does not have a preferential tariff in China. Organic products in general do not have a preferential tariff status as well. And additionally, we see that there's a certain perception of non-tariff barriers between China and Kenya, particularly related to the tea sector. There were certain instances of containers of tea either being returned or even incinerated at certain points, containers exported from Kenya to China, that is, because of non-compliance on certain standards around rare earth metals or other measures which the Kenyan industry doesn't even actually track. So this lack of information and standardization and knowledge sharing between the two countries leads to sort of a perception of non-trade barriers existing, or China not being open to importing a lot of tea. And as we've seen from Maria's statistics earlier, that really isn't the case. We recommend that the Chinese and the Kenyan governments follow a similar model to that followed by Sri Lanka and China, wherein they negotiated preferential tariff agreements, tariff rates, and a free trade agreement that covered tea as well, and which has now seen Sri Lanka become the largest exporter of tea to China, with 33% of total tea exports from tea imports for China coming from Sri Lanka, as compared to 2.5% for Kenya. And lastly, the one point that I think covers, that cuts across all our sectors, but I think is a little more pertinent for tea, considering these are two of the top 3 tea growers in the world, is the lack of business linkages and the lack of market linkages in this sector. during our research on both sides, we found an absolute lack of information, a lack of standardization across practices and in terms of recognizing opportunities. And we believe that this, the sooner that there's an effort, a concerted institutional effort made in linking these two large industries, not just as supply and demand, but just as two global players in the tea market of the world, the better it would be for the sector. And leveraging existing diplomatic, private sector as well as public sector relationships to actually promote tea and promote organic products is one of the key initiatives that we think both governments need to take soon.
Thank you, Himat. As we know, China is already playing an important role in the development of many African nations, including Kenya. What we hope to have showed you today is that there are key sectors, such as ecotourism, distributed renewable energy, and organic tea, in which increased economic cooperation between China and Kenya can result in sustainable development that has both social and environmental benefits for both countries. We'd like to thank Raul Roman, Tanvi Nagpal, Deborah Brodigam, and Idaho from SAIS for their invaluable support. In addition to that, we'd like to thank Dr. Hu Tao, Dan Riley, Jing Yu Ji, Filippo Diambo, Joseph Katiwa, Ali Mosarai, as well as Yi Ting and Tracy Wang for their help in conducting this work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question about responsible sourcing for the tea team. How do you ensure that there's going to be no traffic labor, no child labor, fair wages for tea that is sourced in Kenya? And also, is there a growing market for responsible sourcing in China?
Thanks, Joseph. So one of the key features of the Kenyan tea industry is a very, very robust monitoring and enabling environment, really. The Kenya Tea Board plays a very central role and extends its services and data collection on both sides of the spectrum, whether it's supply as well as demand. So every acre of tea planted in the country is registered with the Tea Board. Minimum wages are again set by the Tea Board. In fact, very recently, last year, there were certain protests and huge negotiation between tree grower associations and the Tea Board around raising the minimum wages for Kenyan tea workers. So, as Maria highlighted, certifications like Rainforest, UTZ are really, really common in Kenya as well. So, and as a result, there's a very, very robust M&E setup in the tea industry, which makes it fairly easy to track every grain of tea produced and all the various factors of production that went into it.
Yeah. And then you had a question about responsible tourism as well, yes?
No, it's responsible sourcing.
Okay, tourism, okay. Never mind.
Sorry. Go ahead. Great job to all of you. Fascinating presentation. My question is for the tea group, because it strikes me of all of these, to mix metaphors, tea is the one where you've got the low-hanging fruits. Yeah. But my puzzle is you've got these incredibly strong institutions on all sides. You've got what seems to be an extraordinary market opportunity, and you don't seem to have movement. So my two-part question for you is, what are the binding constraints as you see that are blocking that movement? And what do you see if you could pick? I mean, you had a lot of recommendations. What would be the entry point that you would focus on to try and unlock change?
I'll pick up the Kenya side, and you can take China. Thank you. That's a very, very good question, and one that I asked myself a lot of times while I was in Nairobi. I think it's important to understand the history of the tea market in Kenya and how it grew to really answer this question. Kenya is not a tea consumer. Only 5% of the total tea is actually consumed in Kenya. So as a result, there's very little conversation and narrative building around the various kinds of tea that are in demand, the production processes, qualities, variety within the country. It's completely led by the demand destinations. So if you look at the top 5 destinations, Pakistan, UAE, Afghanistan, the UK, and a few neighboring countries. These destinations have traditionally been the largest export partners and take more than 65% of the total tea produced. So as a result, and this came out with a conversation with a lot of individuals in the private sector, particularly traders and brokers who are working with people across the globe. They said that there's a certain sense of inertia within the tea market and this over-reliance on the bulk export method where they've seemed to have increased the area under cultivation and reached a certain level of comfort where business as usual is good enough for the people around. This again is just coming primarily through research. And I think there's an element of truth in that because as you said, the opportunity is there. There's a very robust governance structure. But the lack of value addition and this over-reliance on the bulk export model, I think, is one of the biggest weaknesses of the Kenyan tea industry. Whether you look at organic or inorganic, I mean, that's a different play altogether. But the lack of moving towards a retail-ready model and just sticking to the status quo, which is packing in 50 kg bags and transporting it in containers. And very often you find, I met a trader who gave me an example of the tea we were actually drinking at that time had been sold from Kenya to a buyer in the UAE, packaged and then bought off a retail store in Mombasa. So, which kind of brings us back to the same point. So, I'm tempted to say that it's inertia on the Kenyan side and a lack of agitation with the status quo that is actually a key contributor towards this sector not exploding the way it should.
Yeah, and to address the question more on the Chinese side, I think what Sri Lanka has done in terms of tea is very interesting. They have actually connected through the embassies and commercial attachés at the embassies. They have actually held a number of press conferences in Beijing at the Sri Lankan embassy to promote the benefits of their tea. And this is something that we haven't seen, working with the Kenya, Nairobi and Beijing, we haven't really seen that. And on top of that, in terms of market entry, I spoke to an organic retailer in Beijing, which does this kind of high-end organic products, and they create these boxes that they send out to consumers. It's a delivery service, and it's very high, very high price and tailored to, your white-collar, urban, high-income earners in Beijing. And they are the ones that sell, top-notch organic tea, organic black tea and green tea as well. So we think something like this, branded with, mark of origin Kenya, organic label, this kind of thing, a high-end product that is retail ready, that looks expensive, that is nice, of high quality. I think that could really sell in the market. And that was something that the retailer that I spoke to, Beyond Organic in Beijing, that's something they would be interested in getting.
Fine.
Thank you so much for sitting through these really dense presentations. And I just want to tell you there were 23 students who took part in the practicum this year. There are likely to be 20 to 23 students again next year. It takes a lot of work to put the practicum together every year, to find the right clients, to make the right TORs, for these students to negotiate and renegotiate their TORs, for them to carry out field work. And I'm hoping that all of you will think about hosting a team, and please reach out to us and reach out to the students, ask them lots of questions, and we'd be happy to talk to you. I'd be happy to talk to you at a personal level throughout the summer if you'd like to have a team. So thank you very much. It's a win-win for everybody, and I'm so delighted. Aren't they amazing? They're so amazing. Congratulations, you guys. Go get drinks. There's lots of really good food.